I purchased my modest lakefront home in Willow Creek Estates 7 years ago. It was not the largest or most luxurious property in the neighborhood, but it was mine, and it had the one feature I had dreamed about since childhood: direct access to a beautiful lake. The crystal-clear waters of Lake Serenity stretched across 20 acres, reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror on calm mornings. My back porch faced the water, providing a front-row seat to breathtaking sunrises that painted the surface with gold and crimson. That view alone was worth every dollar of my mortgage payment. My dock extended 15 feet into the water, built with my own hands during that first summer. At the end of it, my pride and joy was always waiting: a 24-foot pontoon boat that had seen better days aesthetically, but ran like a dream. I purchased it second-hand the week after closing on the house. The previous owner had maintained the engine meticulously despite the faded seats and weathered deck. I named her Freedom, perhaps a bit cliché, but nothing else captured what those weekend pontoon rides meant to me. Every Saturday morning followed the same ritual: coffee on the dock at sunrise, breakfast while planning the day, and then loading a small cooler with sandwiches and drinks before untying Freedom and setting out across the lake. Sometimes friends would join me. Other times, I enjoyed the solitude, dropping anchor in the middle of the water with nothing but my thoughts and a good book. The stress of my accounting job seemed to dissolve the moment the motor hummed to life. Those pontoon rides kept me sane through difficult weeks. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association existed when I purchased my home, but their presence was minimal in those early years. Quarterly meetings, reasonable maintenance of common areas, and standard regulations about lawn care and exterior paint colors. Nothing unusual or intrusive. I attended meetings occasionally, voted when required, and generally appreciated their efforts to maintain property values. That all changed 3 years ago when several board members moved away and new leadership took over. The first signs of trouble were subtle. New signs appeared around the lake outlining specific hours for water activities. A list of approved watercraft was distributed to all homeowners, though my pontoon clearly fell within the guidelines. At the quarterly meeting, I noticed the new board president, Karen Wilson, watching with obvious disapproval as I described recent dock maintenance during the community updates portion. "Mr. Parker," she said after I finished speaking, her voice carrying that particular tone that somehow manages to sound polite while being completely condescending, "please ensure that any modifications to lakefront structures are submitted for board approval in advance next time." I nodded politely, though the dock repair involved simply replacing 2 weathered boards, hardly a modification requiring committee approval. Over the following months, I noticed Karen or other board members seemed to materialize whenever I took Freedom out on the water. They would stand on the community dock with clipboards, making notes and taking photographs. Sometimes they would time how long I spent on the lake. The carefree atmosphere that had drawn me to Willow Creek was slowly being strangled by an invisible web of surveillance and control. Several neighbors with boats mentioned receiving warning letters for minor infractions. Something was changing in our once peaceful lake community, and not for the better. The official-looking envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. I recognized the HOA letterhead immediately but thought nothing of it, probably the monthly newsletter or a notice about upcoming landscaping in common areas. I tossed it on the kitchen counter while brewing coffee, planning to read it later before heading to work. If only I had known how that innocent-looking envelope would upend my life. When I finally opened it during breakfast, my coffee mug froze halfway to my lips. The notice inside was printed on formal letterhead with bold red letters across the top: "Violation notice, immediate action required." Below that, in cold, impersonal language, was an explanation that I had been found in repeated violation of HOA Bylaw Section 7.3, subsection C, regarding unauthorized and non-compliant watercraft usage. The fine amount listed at the bottom of the page made me choke on my coffee. $10,000. I read and reread the notice, certain there must be some mistake. According to the document, my pontoon boat exceeded the recently amended size restrictions for personal watercraft and had been operated during non-designated hours on multiple occasions. Furthermore, the excessive frequency of usage violated noise and traffic regulations designed to maintain the tranquil character of the community waterway. I immediately called the HOA management company. There must be some mistake, I explained to the disinterested representative who answered. I have owned this boat for 7 years. It has never been an issue before. The bylaws were amended 3 months ago, sir, the representative responded in a monotone voice. The information was included in the March newsletter and posted on the community website. The fine stands as issued. $10,000 for using my own boat on the lake behind my house. This is absurd, I protested. You can appeal at the next board meeting if you wish. Payment is due within 30 days regardless. The call ended with me staring at my phone in disbelief. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. I arrived early, violation notice and boat documentation in hand. The community center was unusually crowded that evening, with several neighbors nodding sympathetically as I took my seat. Apparently, word of my massive fine had spread. When the meeting began, Karen Wilson took her place at the center of the board table. She was the perfect picture of suburban authority. Expensively highlighted blonde hair cut in a precise bob, designer clothing that somehow passed as casual, and that permanent expression of mild disappointment directed at anyone who dared question her vision for our community. During the open forum, I raised my hand and was acknowledged. I would like to discuss this violation notice, I said, keeping my voice steady despite my rising anger. My pontoon boat has been on this lake for 7 years without issue. The fine amount is completely disproportionate, and I was never properly notified of any rule changes. Karen smiled the way a teacher might at a particularly slow student. Mr. Parker, the amendments to watercraft regulations were properly posted according to HOA procedures. Your boat exceeds our 18-foot length restriction by a full 6 feet. We have documented at least 12 instances of usage during quiet hours in the past 2 months alone. The fine amount reflects the severity and repetitive nature of these violations. But $10,000, I protested. That is more than some people pay in HOA fees for an entire decade. This cannot possibly be reasonable enforcement. The board has unanimously determined that significant penalties are necessary to ensure compliance, Karen replied, gesturing to the other 4 board members who nodded in unison like well-trained puppets. We have a responsibility to maintain standards and protect property values. After being summarily dismissed, I spoke with several neighbors in the parking lot. What emerged was a disturbing pattern. Martin Jenkins had been fined $5,000 for a pergola that was apparently 6 inches taller than regulations permitted. Sophia Williams faced a $3,500 penalty for the wrong shade of beige on her newly painted garage door. All these excessive fines had begun after Karen took control of the board. She has been building up the HOA Reserve Fund, whispered Eleanor Davis, who had lived in the community for 20 years. Rumor has it she wants to completely renovate the community center and add a guardhouse at the entrance, projects that were voted down twice before due to cost. I drove home that night with a sickening realization. This was not about rules or community standards. This was about power and money. Karen was using her position to extract funds from residents to support her own vision for the neighborhood. The regular appeals process would be useless against this kind of systematic abuse. I needed to find another way to fight back. The following weekend, instead of taking freedom out on the lake, I found myself buried in paperwork. My dining table disappeared under stacks of documents. My property deed, HOA covenants, county records, and anything else I could find related to Willow Creek Estates. If I was going to fight this ridiculous fine, I needed to understand exactly what authority the HOA actually had over me and my property. I started with my own deed and the attached covenants. The legal language was dense, but after several hours, I began noticing something odd. While there were extensive references to lakefront properties and water access rights, the lake itself was mentioned only in terms of adjoining or adjacent to the properties. Nothing explicitly stated that the HOA owned or controlled the actual body of water. This discovery led me deeper into research mode. I requested copies of the original development plans from the county records office. The clerk looked at me strangely when I explained what I was looking for, but she helped me locate the files nonetheless. I spent an entire day in the dusty records room, tracing the history of Willow Creek Estates from its initial development 25 years ago through various amendments and additions. By the time the office closed, my eyes were burning from strain, but I had found something potentially groundbreaking. According to the original development documents, the builder had created the man-made lake as a centerpiece for the community. However, in the final property plats filed with the county, the lake itself was registered as a separate parcel, not included in the common areas transferred to the HOA upon completion of the development. I could barely sleep that night. If my interpretation was correct, the HOA had been exercising authority over something they did not actually own for decades. But I needed expert confirmation before moving forward. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney named Michael Branson, who specialized in property disputes. His office was 40 minutes away in the city, and he agreed to see me that afternoon. I arrived with my carefully organized research notes and observations. "So let me get this straight," Michael said after reviewing my documents for nearly an hour. "You believe the lake itself was never transferred to the HOA's ownership, despite them regulating it for 25 years. "That is what the records suggest," I replied. "Am I misinterpreting something?" Michael leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "No, Mr. Parker, your research is surprisingly thorough. Based on these documents, it appears the development company retained ownership of the actual lake, while granting access rights to the community. This happens occasionally with amenities like golf courses or lakes. Developers maintain control of the valuable asset while selling the surrounding properties." My heart raced as the implications became clear. "So the HOA has no legal right to fine me for using my boat on the lake?" "Not exactly," Michael cautioned. "The HOA can still regulate access points, docks, and even the types of activities permitted from properties under their jurisdiction. But the water itself, that belongs to whoever currently holds title to that specific parcel." "And who would that be now?" I asked, already formulating a plan. "That would require additional research," Michael replied. "If the original development company went bankrupt or was dissolved, ownership might have transferred to a bank, another corporate entity, or even reverted to individuals. Finding the current owner would be our first step." I stared at the lake parcel map spread on his desk, and hypothetically, could that parcel be purchased by an individual? Michael studied my face carefully. "Hypothetically, yes, but it would likely be expensive and there could be existing easements or access rights that would need to be honored. This would not be a simple or inexpensive process. I thought about the $10,000 fine, about Karen's smug face at the HOA meeting, about the systematic way she was using her power to bully residents. Sometimes, justice has a price tag. I want to find the current owner, I said firmly, and if possible, I want to explore purchasing the lake. Michael raised an eyebrow. That would be a bold move, Mr. Parker. Are you sure you want to pursue this? I nodded, thinking of my pontoon boat gently rocking at my dock. Freedom is worth fighting for. Michael worked quickly. Within a week, he had traced the ownership chain of Lake Serenity. The development company had indeed maintained ownership of the lake parcel after completing Willow Creek Estates. When that company was acquired by a larger corporation 10 years later, the lake remained a separate asset. Through a series of corporate reorganizations and property transfers, the lake eventually ended up in the portfolio of an investment trust managed for the original developer, Howard Wilkins. Howard Wilkins is still alive, I asked in surprise during our follow-up meeting. Very much so, Michael confirmed. 87 years old and living in Arizona. According to my contact at the property management firm, he has largely forgotten about this particular asset. It generates no income, requires minimal maintenance that the HOA has unknowingly been providing, and has simply remained in his investment portfolio as an overlooked remnant of his development days. Do you think he would sell it? My question hung in the air between us. There is only one way to find out, Michael replied, sliding a phone number across the desk. That evening, with sweaty palms and a racing heart, I called Howard Wilkins. After explaining who I was and how I had obtained his number, I expected to be quickly dismissed. Instead, the elderly developer chuckled warmly. Willow Creek, he mused, his voice carrying the slight tremor of age. That was one of my favorite projects. Beautiful location. Smart of you to notice the lake ownership situation. Most people never bother reading the fine print. Would you consider selling the lake parcel, Mr. Wilkins? I asked directly. Possibly. It serves no purpose in my portfolio at this point. What did you have in mind? We discussed possibilities, and to my surprise, Howard seemed genuinely interested in my situation with the HOA. I never intended for the community to become a dictatorship, he commented. The HOA was meant to maintain standards, not terrorize residents. After 30 minutes of conversation, Howard agreed to consider an offer. Michael helped me draft a formal proposal, and within days we had a tentative agreement. The price, $175,000 for the 20-acre lake, not insignificant, but far less than I had feared for waterfront property. The catch was that Howard wanted to close quickly, within 30 days, and insisted on complete confidentiality until the transaction was complete. Now came the difficult part, financing the purchase. My savings account held only $30,000, nowhere near enough. I owned considerable equity in my home, but taking a second mortgage would raise questions I was not ready to answer. After careful consideration, I made hard choices. I liquidated my non-retirement investment accounts for $65,000. I borrowed $40,000 from my 401k, accepting the penalties and tax implications. Finally, I reluctantly called my older brother, explained the situation in strict confidence, and secured a personal loan for the remaining $40,000. All while keeping up normal appearances in the neighborhood. I continued my routine, going to work, maintaining my yard to HOA standards, and even attending the monthly meeting where Karen pointedly reminded me that my fine payment deadline was approaching. I smiled politely and assured her I was working on a resolution. The double meaning of my words gave me the only joy I experienced during those stressful weeks. Michael handled the details masterfully, establishing a limited liability company called Serenity Waters LLC to make the purchase and maintain my anonymity. All meetings with title companies and signings were scheduled during business hours when Karen and her board members would be at work. Each document was reviewed meticulously to ensure there were no loopholes or issues that could invalidate the transaction. The closing meeting took place at a title company 30 miles away from Willow Creek Estates. Howard Wilkins participated by phone from Arizona, his documents having been signed and notarized the previous day. As I signed my name on page after page, the enormity of what I was doing occasionally threatened to overwhelm me. I was purchasing an entire lake, the centerpiece of our community, without a single neighbor knowing. "Congratulations, Mr. Parker," the title agent said as I signed the final document. "You are now the legal owner of Lake Serenity." Michael handed me a sealed envelope containing the recorded deed and official ownership documentation. "Remember, this changes nothing yet," he cautioned. "Until we implement the next phase of our plan, you should continue behaving exactly as before. No one can know." I nodded, clutching the envelope that represented both the most financially reckless and potentially satisfying decision of my life. As I drove home that evening, I gazed at my lake gleaming in the sunset. The water rippled gently in the breeze, unaware that ownership had changed hands. My pontoon boat bobbed at the dock, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a genuine smile. Phase 1 was complete. Now for the truly difficult part, preparing for the revelation that would change everything. Owning Lake Serenity was only the first step in my plan. To make this work, to truly turn the tables on Karen and the HOA board, everything needed to be meticulously organized and legally unassailable. Michael assembled a team of specialists, a property rights attorney, a water resource expert, and a corporate law specialist. For 2 weeks, we worked tirelessly to build an ironclad strategy. The first priority was establishing Serenity Waters LLC as a legitimate business entity with proper documentation and legal standing. We drafted comprehensive terms of use for the lake, carefully structured to protect the reasonable access rights of homeowners while establishing clear ownership boundaries. Every document was reviewed multiple times to ensure it would withstand inevitable legal challenges. Technically, you could restrict all access to the lake immediately, the property rights attorney explained during one of our planning sessions. But courts tend to recognize established patterns of use, especially when properties were purchased with the understanding that lake access was included. Our approach needs to be reasonable while still asserting your rights as the owner. We decided that homeowners would retain access rights for swimming, fishing, and non-motorized watercraft. However, motorized boats would require specific permission and licensing from Serenity Waters LLC, completely legal given my ownership position. The corporate attorney helped establish a fee structure and permit system that was defensible if challenged. Meanwhile, I commissioned professional private property signs that clearly identified the lake as belonging to Serenity Waters LLC. These would not be posted until the right moment. I also ordered official letterhead, created a business email address, and established a separate bank account for the company. Every detail mattered if this was going to work. At home, I maintained my normal routine. When I encountered Karen at the grocery store, I politely asked about the process for appealing my fine. She reminded me condescendingly that the deadline for payment was only 2 weeks away and suggested I save everyone the time and trouble by simply paying the fine. It took every ounce of self-control not to reveal what was coming. The pressure from the HOA intensified. A formal letter arrived warning that failure to pay the fine would result in a lien being placed on my property. Karen even had a board member call to express concern about my financial situation and offer a payment plan. The thinly veiled threats only strengthened my resolve and confirmed I was doing the right thing. My garage, converted temporarily into a staging area, the elements of my plan accumulated. Boxes of official notices to be distributed to all lakefront homeowners, a presentation folder containing certified copies of the lake deed and property records, large format maps showing the exact boundaries of my newly acquired property, and most satisfying of all, a formal notice of trespassing violations with calculated fines for the HOA's unauthorized use of private property. Michael and I spent hours calculating an appropriate counterclaim. We documented every HOA-sponsored event that had taken place on or around the lake over the past year. The 4th of July fireworks display launched from floating platforms, the Labor Day Community Regatta, the weekly water aerobics classes conducted from the community dock. For each event, we assigned a reasonable trespassing fee, then multiplied by the number of participants and days of violation. $2 million in accumulated trespassing fines, Michael said, reviewing our final calculation. Excessive, absolutely, but no more outrageous than their $10,000 fine for using your own boat, and legally defensible given the documented timeline of violations. Every night after these preparation sessions, I would sit on my back porch looking at the lake, rehearsing what I would say when the moment finally arrived. Sometimes doubt crept in. Was I going too far? Was this worth the significant financial risk I had taken? But then another threatening letter would arrive from the HOA, or I would see Karen photographing some minor violation on a neighbor's property, and my determination would return stronger than ever. The HOA announced an emergency community meeting to address ongoing lake access issues and delinquent violations. The timing could not have been more perfect. Karen clearly intended this meeting to make an example of me publicly. Little did she know, she was scheduling the perfect stage for her own comeuppance. The night before the meeting, I called Michael. "Everything is ready," I confirmed. "Signs, documents, notices, all prepared." "And you are absolutely certain you want to go through with this?" he asked one final time. "Once this happens, there is no going back. Your relationships with many neighbors will change forever." I looked out at my pontoon boat at the lake glimmering under the moonlight. "Some things are worth fighting for, Michael. This is about more than just my boat or a fine. This is about standing up to a bully who has been abusing her power for far too long." "Then I will see you tomorrow," he replied. "Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be memorable." The community center was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Willow Creek Estates had turned out for the emergency meeting, creating a buzz of curiosity and speculation. I arrived 15 minutes early, accompanied by Michael, who carried a professional briefcase containing our documents. We chose seats in the middle of the room, visible enough to make an impact but not so obvious as to telegraph our intentions. Karen and the board members entered precisely at 7:00 p.m., taking their places at the head table with practiced efficiency. Karen wore a crisp white blazer that somehow emphasized her authority, her expression serious yet containing a hint of satisfaction as she surveyed the crowd. Her gaze paused briefly on me, and I detected the slightest smile, the look of a predator confident in the trap she had set. "Thank you all for coming to this important emergency session," Karen began, her voice carrying that perfect balance of concern and command. "We have several pressing community matters to address, particularly regarding lake usage regulations and the enforcement of our community standards." For the next 20 minutes, Karen detailed recent disturbing trends in rule violations, emphasizing the board's responsibility to maintain property values and community aesthetics. Though she never mentioned me by name, her frequent references to watercraft violations and significant outstanding fines made her target clear to everyone present. When homeowners refuse to comply with clearly established regulations, Karen continued, her voice hardening, the board has no choice but to escalate enforcement measures. Effective next week, the board will begin placing property liens on homes with unpaid violation notices exceeding $5,000. Murmurs spread through the room. This was a significant escalation, one that directly threatened my home. Several neighbors glanced sympathetically in my direction. Karen allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before continuing. Now, regarding lake access and usage, she said, transitioning to the next agenda item. The board has drafted additional regulations to ensure that our community amenity remains pristine and available for compliant residents to enjoy. This was the moment. I nodded slightly to Michael, who opened his briefcase and removed a folder. I stood slowly, my heart pounding but my voice steady when I spoke. Before we proceed with new regulations, I believe there is an important legal matter regarding the lake that requires immediate attention. Karen looked annoyed at the interruption. Mr. Parker, there is a designated time for open comments at the end of the meeting. Please take your seat. This cannot wait, I replied firmly, moving toward the front of the room. It directly impacts the agenda item you just introduced. The room fell silent as I approached the board table. Michael followed, placing the folder in front of me as I stood facing the assembled neighbors. Karen's expression shifted from irritation to wary curiosity. For the past 25 years, I began, the Willow Creek Estates HOA has been exercising authority over Lake Serenity, creating rules for its use, hosting events on its waters, and most recently, imposing significant fines for alleged violations of those rules. I paused, making eye contact with several homeowners. There is, however, one critical issue with this arrangement. I opened the folder and removed the first document, a certified copy of the original development plat. The HOA has never actually owned the lake. The statement hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted in confused conversations. Karen attempted to regain control, rapping her gavel sharply on the table. That is simply not true, she declared. The lake is part of the common areas maintained by HOA fees. Actually, I continued, sliding the document toward her, the original developer, Howard Wilkins, registered the lake as a separate parcel distinct from the community common areas. While the HOA maintains the surrounding landscape and access points, the 20 acres of water comprising Lake Serenity has always remained separate property. Karen examined the document with growing concern, her composure visibly shaken. This is ancient history, she dismissed. The developer transferred all assets to the HOA upon completion of the community. All assets except the lake, I corrected, producing the next document, the complete ownership change showing how the lake had remained separate from the HOA properties through multiple corporate transitions. By now, board members were huddling around the documents, their expressions increasingly troubled. Neighbors were standing to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Even if this was once true, Karen argued, recovering slightly, after 25 years of established management, the HOA has de facto control through precedent and practice. An interesting legal theory, I acknowledged. One that might hold weight if the current owner chose not to assert their property rights. Unfortunately for the HOA, the current owner has very different intentions. With perfect dramatic timing, Michael handed me the final document, the recorded deed showing transfer of ownership to Serenity Waters LLC. I placed it directly in front of Karen. As of 2 weeks ago, Lake Serenity is my property, I announced to the stunned room. Owned through Serenity Waters LLC, of which I am the sole proprietor. The silence that followed was absolute. Karen stared at the deed, her face cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally, the first traces of fear. "This cannot be legal," she whispered. "I assure you, every aspect of this transaction was thoroughly vetted by legal experts," I replied. "The same experts who helped me prepare this." I produced the final document, the notice of trespassing violations with the calculated $2 million fine. Since I have owned the lake, the HOA has conducted at least 7 unauthorized events on my property, directed traffic on my water, and trespassed repeatedly without permission. Following the precedent set by this board regarding fines for violations, I have calculated appropriate penalties for these actions. I watched as Karen registered the amount on the notice. Her face blanched. $2 million, she gasped. "The same legal authority you claim to fine me $10,000 for using my boat on the lake gives me the right to fine you for using my lake without permission," I explained. "Of course, I am open to reasonable discussion about this matter, something I was not afforded when I tried to address my own alleged violations." The community center erupted in a combination of shocked exclamations, laughter, and applause. Years of frustration with Karen's oppressive leadership found release in this perfect moment of poetic justice. As the implications spread through the room, I noticed several longtime board supporters distancing themselves from Karen, who sat frozen in disbelief, staring at the documentation of her complete reversal of fortune. The weeks following the revelation were a whirlwind of activity. As expected, Karen and her loyalists on the board immediately challenged my ownership of the lake, hearing their own attorneys to find any possible weakness in my position. Their primary argument centered around established usage rights and the doctrine of adverse possession, the legal principle that someone can gain ownership rights by openly using property for an extended period. "Their case has significant weaknesses," Michael assured me during an update meeting. "Adverse possession typically requires the party to believe they own the property. The original HOA documents clearly acknowledge that the lake access is an easement privilege, not ownership. Every challenge they have mounted actually strengthens our position." True to his prediction, each legal maneuver by the HOA board failed. The property records were clear. The purchase was legitimate. My ownership was absolute. After 3 failed legal challenges that only succeeded in draining the HOA reserve fund, reality began to sink in for the community. I owned Lake Serenity, and that changed everything. Neighbors who had once kept their distance, afraid of Karen's retaliation, now approached me with congratulations and support. "Someone finally stood up to her," became a common refrain in conversations around the neighborhood. Even board members began quietly distancing themselves from Karen as her position weakened. With my legal position secure, I moved forward with establishing new lake usage policies. True to my word, I ensured that all homeowners retained reasonable access rights for swimming, fishing, and non-motorized watercraft. For motorized boats, I created a simple registration system with nominal annual fees, except for board members who had supported the excessive fine against me. For them, I established substantially higher rates, all perfectly legal under my rights as the property owner. "You do not have the authority to discriminate against board members." Karen argued during a particularly heated exchange at the next community meeting. Actually, as a private property owner, I have considerable latitude in establishing access fees, I countered. Of course, any board member who voted against the excessive fine policy is welcome to the standard community rate. The strategic beauty of this approach became apparent immediately. Two board members publicly admitted they had opposed the excessive fines, but had been outvoted by Karen and her allies. This revelation fractured the board's united front and exposed Karen's domineering leadership style. By the third month, community sentiment had shifted dramatically. A special election was called to replace two board members who resigned rather than continue under the cloud of controversy. Both were replaced by moderate homeowners who campaigned on platforms of reasonable enforcement and transparency. Karen, increasingly isolated, made a final desperate attempt to reassert control. She called for a special assessment, an additional fee charged to all homeowners, to establish a legal defense fund for continuing the fight over lake ownership. The proposal was soundly defeated in a community vote, marking the effective end of her authority. The final resolution came more quietly than the dramatic revelation. Karen requested a private meeting with me and Michael. Gone was the imperious HOA president who had terrorized the neighborhood. In her place sat a subdued woman who recognized her untenable position. "What would it take to resolve this situation?" she asked simply. Our terms were straightforward: immediate cancellation of all excessive fines against homeowners, Karen's resignation from the board, and establishment of a community oversight committee to review all future fine proposals before implementation. In exchange, I would waive the trespassing fines and grant the HOA a formal easement agreement for reasonable community events on the lake. The agreement was finalized within a week. Karen listed her house for sale the following month. Today, 2 years later, Lake Serenity lives up to its name. My pontoon boat, still named Freedom, makes regular journeys across the water without harassment or scrutiny. Weekend gatherings at the community dock have become friendly social events rather than opportunities for rule enforcement. The new HOA board operates with transparency and reasonable enforcement of truly necessary regulations. As for me, I still smile every time I push off from my dock and guide Freedom into the center of my lake. The financial strain of the purchase was substantial, and it will take years to recover financially from the bold move. But some forms of wealth cannot be measured in dollars. Each time a neighbor waves from their dock as I pass, each time children splash joyfully in the water without a clipboard-wielding board member timing their activities, I am reminded that standing up to bullies, even those draped in the authority of rules and regulations, is sometimes the only way to restore balance and sanity to a community. Some might call it petty revenge. I prefer to think of it as justice, served on the sparkling waters of a lake that reminded me what freedom really means.